Variable fonts are set to be the next big thing in web typography, especially when you consider they're coming from a rare cooperative effort between Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Adobe. They allow for more creativity and design freedom than web designers have ever had with type before, and that's all while simultaneously reducing your font load time down to a half, a third, a quarter, or maybe even less. In this course, you'll learn what variable fonts are, why they're such a big step forward, and everything you need to know to start designing with them and using them in your websites. So let's get up and running with variable fonts. I'll see you in the first lesson. Hey, this is Kez. Welcome to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this first video, we're going to take a look at one of the two primary reasons that variable fonts are going to be a hugely valuable introduction into your web design life, and that is how much faster they can get your fonts loading in. On any site where you want to use a couple of different variations of a font, so you might want to have a few different weights, you might want to have Italic, you probably will have noticed that loading in these font files can end up being one of the biggest load sinks in your website. And what you can see on the screen here are two examples of the Libra Franklin font. And they look exactly the same, but they're not. On the left side, we've got the normal regular version of the Libra font. And on the right side, we've got the variable font version of Libra Franklin. For each one, we've got several weights. And for every weight, there is a regular and an Italic version. We're going to go into the developer tools and we're going to do a load speed test on each one of these pages to see how different they are. All right, so first up with our standard font, we're going to switch this over. So we're going to emulate a fast 3G connection and we're going to hold down the refresh button, empty cache and hard reload. All right, now let's watch this time down here and see how long it takes for us to bring each one of these different types of fonts into the page. All right, so that's taken a total of 9.89 seconds. Now that's a fairly long time just for fonts. Now let's try the variable version of this font. All right, so we'll give it the same conditions, fast 3G and empty cache hard reload. And look at that. That is the same look of the fonts, but this only took 2.49 seconds. So 2.5 seconds versus almost 10 seconds. So that's a quarter of the load speed for the exact same result as far as the way that your site is going to end up looking. So that is huge. And why does the font load so much faster? The reason is because of what a variable font is. To put it simply, a variable font is just a font with a bunch of settings that you can change in order to modify how the font looks. This font has a setting for weight. And not only are these variable fonts modifiable, you're also going to be able to control those modifications using CSS. This Libra Franklin variable font, it has a setting that allows you to control the weight. So you can take one Roman style font file and you can then change the slider on that weight setting so that you get all these different weights. Whereas with the standard version of the font, I need a separate file for every single weight that I want to use in my site. So then I have to choose, do I want a slow loading site? Or do I want to limit my options with what I can do with my fonts? So if we have another look at our DevTools and in our Network tab, you can see that with the regular font, we need all these different files if we want to have all of these different looks for our font. Meanwhile, for our variable font, we've only needed two. One for the Roman style version of the font and one for the italics. And actually with most variable fonts, you don't even need two files, you only need one because a lot of them will have a modifiable setting in them to control the slant on the letters, meaning that you can control things like weight and italics with only one font file, so that's going to be even faster again. We can see here that this font file loaded in only 1.74 seconds. So we can probably roughly halve this load time, and that's bringing that down to about an eighth of the loading time that the other version of the font needed to bring in all of these different variants. So that is massive. That is one of the biggest things that variable fonts has to offer. And in this example, we're only looking at the impact of weight. But the cool thing about variable fonts is there can actually be all kinds of different settings that you can modify to give you a myriad of different looks, but in no case will you get any extra load time. And that actually brings us to the topic that we're going to be covering in the next video, and that is the amount of creativity and design control that variable fonts can unlock. Here we've just looked at the kind of variations that you're used to seeing in fonts, but variable fonts are not restricted to just changing weight. They can change all kinds of things in a font. So in the next video, we're going to check out some of these really interesting new variable fonts that are coming up, and you're going to see some of the cool stuff that you can do with variable fonts with no added load time, and in actual fact, likely faster load time than you have with your ordinary run-of-the-mill fonts. So we're going to check that out in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, this is Kez. Welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to check out some of the ways that variable fonts are going to make it possible for you to have more freedom and more design creativity when you're putting together your typography. What you're seeing on the screen here is a website called Access Praxis. There'll be a link to this in the notes below the video. This is a really awesome site where you can go and check out some of these variable fonts that are coming up. We're actually going to go into what this website can do in a little bit more depth later. But now I just want to use this site to show you some of the cool creative aspects of variable fonts. Now this first font here, Mutator Sans, is a really interesting example because it shows you the massive amount of variability that you can have in a single font. So not like in the last video where we had 2 font files. This is just 1 font file. But if you have a look over here on the right, you can see that we've got a couple of sliders where we can modify the width and the weight of this font. Now, when you've worked with font settings before using CSS, say for example, you're setting the font weight, you'll know that you have to set those font weights to pretty strict increments. So there'll be 400 or 700, but not 564, for example. But with variable fonts, you can set your font weight at anything you want along the whole spectrum. So I'm going to select this text up the top here, and now I'm just going to start modifying this weight. And check this out, I can smoothly change the weight of this font to anything that I want. So there's no rule saying I can only have it this bold or this bold. I can do anything that I want with it, whatever suits my design. And by the same token with this font, we've also got the ability to modify the width. So again, I can smoothly change that to create any kind of look that I want for my sites. So that is how you see all of these different types of looks with this one font file. And you can imagine if you had to have a different font file for all the different looks that you see here with this font family, it would blow out your load speed like crazy. You would pretty much have to just decide on maybe 2 variants, 3 at most, and that would be all you had to work with. All right, let's have a look at another example, because width and weight are probably things that you're fairly familiar with from working with typography, but variable fonts are not restricted to just the kinds of variations that you might have experienced before. This font, Nomen, has a built-in drop shadow. And if you have a look at the sliders here, we can actually modify the time of day to give us a different angle on the shadow, and we can modify the shadow distance. And that's not something you're going to see in a CSS setting anytime soon. This is just completely different. The font designer has decided to go ahead and build a drop shadow into this font, and the doors are really wide open for font designers to do anything that they can think of with fonts. And that brings us on to the next font that I want to show you, and that is the Decovar font, which is probably the most interesting variable font that's available right now. Now have a look at this. All of these different styles are all made from the one font file. All that's happened is that one font has had its settings changed. Down here we can see we've got a bunch of different sliders, and these represent all the different things that you can change in this Decovar font. So I can start changing things up, and I can completely turn this into any kind of font that I want. It's incredibly flexible, and this is just one of the early fonts that we get to work with. So there's going to be a whole bunch more variable fonts that come through, and it's going to be really, really interesting to see what kind of creative opportunities that's going to bring to us. All right, so between the massive gains on load speed and the whole world of opportunity for design and creativity that these open up, I think you're probably starting to get the picture of why variable fonts are so interesting. So now we're going to start moving on to how they actually work and what you need to know to start using them yourself. The first thing that we're going to look at is the actual settings that power variable fonts. These settings are actually called axes. So we're going to go through what an axis is and how it drives variable fonts in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to start looking at what actually makes variable fonts work, and that is what's called the axes that each variable font contains. And basically, each axis that a font has is just a setting that you can change controlling how it looks. So we already saw modifying things like width and weight. So if you have a font that has a width and a weight setting, then you can also say it has a width axis and a weight axis. Now there's two types of axis that a variable font can have. There are official registered axis tags, and those tags are a part of OpenType itself. The second type of axis is a custom axis that any designer can decide on for themselves and can add into a font. And what you're looking at on the screen here right now is the 5 currently registered official axes or OpenType variable fonts. There may be more official axes in the future, but for now, these are the ones that we have. So we've got Italic and Slant, which are almost the same, and we're going to dig into what each one of these axes represents a little bit later, and we'll go into just what the difference is between Italic and Slant because they both give you forward-pointing letters. You also have optical size, which basically helps you control how legible your letters are at different sizes. You have width, which, as the name suggests, controls the width of the letters, and you have weight, which controls the weight of the letters. So that's a quick list of those 5 official axes. Now let's go back to Axis Praxis, and we'll have a look at those axes in action. First up, we've got the Voto serif font, and you can see over on the right here, this is where we can mess about with the axes that control the look of this font. A variable font can have 1 axis or it can have 20. It's totally up to the font designer. In this case, we have 3. So I'm going to select this text here. And you already saw this before, but we'll just quickly go over it again. So that's the width axis. We already looked also at the weight axis. The optical size axis. Again, we'll dig into these in more detail later. But this allows you to control how legible the letters are. So if I want to decrease the size of this text here, then I can mess with the optical size to make it more legible. Or if I want to increase it, then I can do the same thing again. So that's 3 of our 5 official axes. Then in the winner font, again, we've got width and weight. And this time we're using the slant axis. And then the 5th is Italic. It's going to give you the same effect, so we won't go over it in any more detail until a later lesson. And then if we just look back at the deck of our font again, here you can see that we have a bunch of custom axes. And the only one that's on the official list is the weight axis. But everything else is completely custom. So I think that when you first hear people talking about the axes in variable fonts, it's not always 100% clear exactly what's meant by that, but you really don't need to think of it with any sort of complexity. All you need to think about is the fact that an axis is a setting, and a setting can change the way the font looks. You've got 5 official settings or axes, and you've got an infinite possible number of custom axes that you'll have to look up on a case-by-case basis for each variable font that you decide to use. And because you can have all kinds of different axes in any particular font, it can get difficult to keep track of what combination of settings actually looks good on a font, and that is why we have something called named instances. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at what named instances are and what role they currently play in the web design workflow. So I will see you in the next lesson. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to talk about what named instances are and what value they offer you as part of web design workflow. So we're looking at our Decobar instance again, and here you can see we have so many different settings and so many different looks for this font that if you were trying to manually recreate all of these looks from memory every time, it would get very difficult very fast. So what we have is the ability for font designers to include something called named instances in their fonts that are something like a bookmark for a particular combination of settings in each of the variables. So if I select this text up here, and then I look over at this instance area on the right, I can see that there's a whole bunch of different named instances. And when I switch that up, you can see that we get a completely different look for the font each time we choose one of these named instances. Now, unfortunately, the downside right now is that even though this information is inside the file, so far there is no way in CSS to specify that you want to use one of these named instances. Hopefully that's something we'll see come up in the future, but right now it's just not there. However, named instances are still a useful thing to be aware of as part of working with these types of fonts in web design. Why? Basically because they give you an easy way to look up combinations of settings that work really well that you can then reproduce in your designs. But named instances are also useful even if you don't have the kind of complexity that you have with a font like Decobar. And I'll show you an example. So we have the Libra Franklin font. We looked at this earlier as well. And this is just the regular version of the font that's hosted on Google Fonts right now. You can see that we have all of these different variations of the font, and each one of them has a name: semi-bold, semi-bold italic, bold, bold italic, and so on. If we look at the variable font version of Libra Franklin and we look at the named instances that it has, we have the exact same set of names. So this is actually the italic version of the font. But so we've got semi-bold, italic. We look at the Roman version, then we have semi-bold. So we have all of those same looks that we have in the main font. And why is that useful? It's useful because this can act as a guide for us to recreate in CSS the same looks that we have in the regular version of the font. So if we know we want to reproduce bold italic, then we can take a look at the italic version of the font. We can have a look at the named instance that represents what we want, and then we can see the value that we need to put against the axis that's controlling how the font looks. And we're going to be digging into putting together code later. So I'm just going to quickly show you how this might look in application. This is the code for the demo that I showed you earlier in the course, illustrating how much faster variable fonts can load. And what I've done here is just create a class name for each one of those named instances. And then I've carried the settings over from that named instance into my CSS. This font just uses that one axis, so it's relatively simple to code in CSS. A little bit later, we'll go through how you can handle more complex sets of axes as well. So that gives you an idea of what named instances are, how they relate to axis settings, and how they're actually useful in web design, even though we can't access those named instances through CSS just yet. All right, so now you're getting across the fundamentals of variable fonts, which basically boils down to their axes and their named instances. The next question is, well, how do you actually find variable fonts? Variable fonts are still relatively new, so they can be a little tricky to find. So in the next lesson, we're going to go over how you can best look for variable fonts. So we'll see you in the next lesson. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to go over a couple of places you can actually look to find variable fonts that you might want to use in your projects. The first place to look is a site that you've already seen a few times so far in this course, and that is accesspraxis.org. And if you look down the left-hand side here, you're going to find a pretty decent list of variable fonts. So honestly, this is probably the easiest place to start with your search for variable fonts. And as well as the fonts that they're displaying in this little playground here, they're also managing this Google Docs spreadsheet that shows you even more fonts. Some of these I assume probably have licensing issues, so that's why you don't see them in the playground. But this is a super comprehensive list of fonts. Maybe it'll miss some here and there, but this is also a really great place to look. So there'll be links to this in the notes below this video. The third place that I would recommend looking is vfonts.com, v-fonts.com. This is a lot like accesspraxis. It's a slightly simpler website, but you can go through and check out a whole bunch of different fonts here. Just be sure when you get to the bottom that you hit the load more button so that you can keep looking for more font families. Now, unfortunately, right now it doesn't seem like there are any variable fonts hosted on Google Fonts. However, I expect that's probably going to change given that Google are involved in the development of these open type variable fonts, and also considering that they've been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years to try to help websites load faster. And the Libra Franklin font that we've been looking at a little bit so far, it's already on Google Fonts, but its regular version is on there, so I'm guessing it's probably just going to be a matter of time until we see the variable font version. We also have the Spectral font, which is on Google Fonts. This font describes itself as a parametric font rather than a variable font, but given the fact that it can change itself up, I think this is another probable prospect for us to see on Google Fonts as a variable font. So those are some lists, and then the final tip that I would give you for finding variable fonts is actually to search for articles on variable fonts, particularly those written by any of the 4 companies that are working on these fonts. So that's Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Adobe, because that can also be a good way to find fonts that you like. So for example, this is Microsoft's demonstration of variable fonts. It's actually a pretty cool demonstration if you fancy checking it out at some point. And then you can just inspect these fonts, jump into the computer tab, and see what font family it is that you're looking at. So in this case, that is the Bandschrift font. So that's it, just a quick video on this topic. At first, it can be a little off-putting when you go to all of your normal places to try to find fonts to work with and you can't find any variable fonts. So instead, head to the places that I've just described here and you should have plenty to play with. Alright, so then once you've actually found some fonts that you like and you've downloaded them, how can you go about actually previewing them so that you can tinker around a little bit with the access settings and make doubly sure that these are fonts that you actually want to make use of? Well, that is where you need some kind of preview tool. So we're going to go into how you can preview variable fonts that you have downloaded in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. So you've found a variable font that you like, you've downloaded the file, and now you want to preview it, see what happens when you change its access settings around and make sure it's something that it's actually worth putting more time into working with. When you download a font, you might be lucky and get documentation that tells you about the different settings that it has available, or you might get absolutely nothing, and that's where you really need a preview tool. And that's why, yet again, we're back at Access Praxis because it provides that functionality. And this is probably the easiest preview tool that's available right now because it's online, meaning you can access it anywhere. Now, if you look up in this section here, you can see this little place says drag and drop fonts here. And really, that's all you have to do. So I have this Libra Franklin font that I've downloaded from GitHub. This is the variable font version. So now all I need to do to preview it is just grab the file, drag and drop. There you go. You can see that it's picked up Libra Franklin regular. I can select this text here. And now it gives me access to all the different named instances. So we can see which instances give us the best kind of look. We can play around with the sliders. And we can ensure this is actually the font that we want to use. You can drag and drop any font file that you want onto this little box and instantly get access to see what named instances it includes and what axes it includes. If you don't have a tool like this, it's almost impossible to actually find out what those named instances are because all that information is buried inside the font files and you need a way to get it out. So there is another option for a font preview tool. If you really don't want to work online, then you can use this open source tool named Font View. This tool will also let you see what named instances a font has, what axes it has, and let you mess around a little bit with the settings for those axes. However, you're going to need to be a little bit technical to work with this so you can build it yourself. It can be built on Mac or on Linux. You might need to work through some build errors as you're putting it together, but if you're comfortable with doing command line building of software, then this might be a great option for you. Unfortunately, it's not available to work on Windows, so in that case, you are going to need to stick with Access Praxis for now. Now, there is one more option for previewing fonts that I want to show you, and that actually takes us into our next lesson, because that option also gives you a means to start creating mockups to form the foundation of your designs, and that is working with Photoshop. As you know, Adobe is part of the development of these fonts, so it's no surprise that we see Photoshop being one of the first pieces of software to support variable fonts. So in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to work with variable fonts inside Photoshop, either for previewing purposes or for creating mockups, and I'm going to give you a little overview of what the landscape looks like for variable font support in other mockup software. So we'll see you in the next lesson. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about what software you can use to create mockups for your sites that are going to be involving variable fonts. So this may change over time, but right now, the best software that you can use if you're wanting to do variable font mockups is either Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator. And that's quite simply because the other applications just simply don't support variable fonts yet. And we'll talk about where that is heading in a little bit after I just show you how variable fonts are going to work in Photoshop. And as I mentioned at the end of the last lesson, not only are you going to be able to use Photoshop to help you with your mockups, but you're also going to be able to install a variable font on your system, then open up Photoshop and have a play around with it using Photoshop as another preview tool. All right, so let's see what you need to do in Photoshop to work with variable fonts. So first, we're just going to select the text tool, and we're just going to add in a little bit of text. And now, if I have a look at my list of available fonts, the first thing that I'm going to want to know is how can I tell the difference between which of my fonts are variable fonts and which of them are regular fonts? Well, Photoshop has actually made this really simple. It's actually pre-installed a whole bunch of variable fonts for you. And the way that you identify them is they have this little var symbol over the O that stands for open type. So any of these var symbol fonts that you choose are going to be fully functional variable fonts that you can check out inside Photoshop. So let's grab the Decavar font. And then we'll check out how Photoshop gives us access to the named instances and the axes in a variable font. So with the layer selected that you have your variable font on, you want to look in the Properties tab here. So if you don't see that on your layout, go up to Windows and then select Properties. Now if we scroll down, now we can see sliders for all of the different axes of Decavar. So we can mess around with any of these as we want. And we can put together whatever kind of variation that we want of our fonts, or we can go up here and we can choose specific named instances to go directly to the different looks that have already been designed as part of the font. And as I mentioned before, that's also going to give us an easy way to look more closely at the axis values that are involved in each one of our named instances so that we can recreate those looks with our CSS. So that's everything that you need to know to work with variable fonts in Photoshop. They're also supported in Adobe Illustrator, so you can use that if you prefer. As far as other software options for mockup design that might be more specifically catering to interface design, I suspect one possibility that might come up in the future is support for variable fonts in Adobe XD. And that actually just became a free piece of software. So definitely keep an eye on that in case Adobe decides to bring over their variable font support into their interface design software. And then I'll just give you a quick update on the status with other design applications. Affinity Designer right now doesn't seem to be showing any particular interest in adding variable font support. On their forum, somebody asked about it, and they've said pretty much that they've got other things that they want to do first before they look at variable fonts. Gravit Designer has said that they do want to add more support for OpenType features, but they haven't specified which OpenType features and if that might involve variables. But keep an eye on version 3.5 to see what comes up in that. Figma have definitely shown a lot of interest in variable fonts. One of the representatives here has said variable fonts are magic. It'd definitely be cool to see them supported in Figma. I'll be sure to add it to our feature request list, so that sounds fairly positive. We can probably expect to see variable fonts show up in Figma in the future. And Envision app also look very interested in variable fonts. They haven't specifically said that they're going to be including support, but they did tweet out that they think the future of web typography looks promising with variable fonts. So I think that's also a pretty good indication that we're going to see support for variable fonts in Envision app. So for now, you're looking at Photoshop and Illustrator, and likely the next ones to come along will probably be Figma, Envision, and possibly Gravit Designer. Alright, so at this point in the process, you've gone and found a variable font, you've previewed it, you've decided that you definitely want to use it in your websites, and now you're almost ready to actually start building. But there's one last step that you have to go through before you can actually get into coding, and that is learning about browser support. So because this is a cooperative effort, we're actually seeing browser support come along much quicker for this than we have with other new features, but it's not quite at 100% yet. So in the next lesson, we're going to go over the level of support that there are in major browsers, any little quirks that you need to look out for, and what's available to help you with development in DevTools. So I will see you in the next lesson. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the status of browser support for variable fonts right now. Later on in the course, we're going to go through how to create fallbacks so that if a browser doesn't have support, it's not going to be a problem. But before we get to that point, you're going to need to know which browser should you use for the actual development part of the process. The best way to check on that is to head to caniuse.com and have a look at their information regarding variable fonts, which is what you can see on the screen here. And right now, Chrome and Edge actually have the best support for variable fonts. They have full support with no known quirks. The browser that we've been using so far to check out variable fonts is Chrome. You see everything is working very well. It's all clear and crisp and just as you would expect it to be. Support in Edge is also very good right now. All the fonts are looking as you would expect them to look. They're neat, they're legible, and they're fully functional. However, just be aware that if you don't have the latest update of Windows, you might have an older version of Edge. And if that's the case, when you look at variable fonts, they'll work, but you might see some scratchy edges on them. Safari does have support, but you can see this little annotation marked with the number 3 here, which tells us that you're going to need macOS 10.13 or higher in order to have that variable font support in Safari. And then the last of the main browsers that leaves us with is Firefox, which doesn't have full support yet. Firefox are usually really far ahead of the game in terms of implementing new features, but in this case it's probably not a big surprise given that the developers of Edge, Chrome and Safari are actually part of the OpenType variable fonts project and Firefox isn't, so they're probably just waiting to get information that they need to act on. Now, with regular Firefox, you can actually use it on Mac with a couple of flags set, but that's not really necessary. If you want to use Firefox as you're developing your design that has variable fonts included, then I recommend that you just use Firefox Nightly, which has full support. So this is Firefox Nightly, and everything looks great, everything works properly, so there's no real reason to mess around with config flags. Just use Nightly and you'll be good to go. And even though Chrome and Edge have the most solid support right now, Firefox may still become the best option for working with variable fonts because they're putting together these sliders that are going to live inside their dev tools that are going to be really helpful for getting into your designer and just tweaking the settings on your axis. You can see this tweet here from Patrick Brossett of Mozilla. He's giving us a little demonstration of how these tools are going to look, and they look very, very useful. And even though this tweet says that the tools are in Nightly, they're actually not in there at the moment. We asked about what the status is of those dev tools, and Patrick let us know that they're being worked on at the moment, and hopefully we're going to see them come out in Firefox 62, which is about a month or two away from now. It's currently the end of May, so just keep a lookout for those tools to appear in Firefox. Alright, so now that you know all about browser support for variable fonts and you know all about the underlying principles that drive them, you're ready to get in to actually using them. So we're now going to move on to the next section of the course titled Let's Get Coding, and we're going to start at the beginning by learning how you can actually load variable fonts into your web pages. So for that, I will see you in the next lesson. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. So far we've gone through and got you across all of the most important things that you need to know about variable fonts before you start working with them. So now we're ready to move into the practical phase and get coding. The first thing that you're going to need to know is how to actually load variable fonts into your website to begin with. We're going to be working with a couple of different font families as we go through and cover all the coding aspects of variable fonts, but to start with, we're going to work with one that we've looked at a couple of times so far, and that is LibreFranklin. So to get the ball rolling, you're going to need to download the files for LibreFranklin, which you can do from their GitHub repository. You see that on the screen here, and I'll include a link in the notes below this video. So you can download it by either cloning this repository if you're familiar with Git, or you can just download the zip, which will bring down all the files from this repo. Then you can extract the zip on your local drive. Once you've extracted the zip, this is what you're going to see, and the actual font files themselves are inside this fonts folder. And these first two folders are the regular version of the font with all the different files for each of the variations. What you want is inside this variable font folder, where you've just got the Italic version and the Roman version of the font. And you can just load these TTF files directly into your website, but it's better if you convert them into the WAF2 format instead. I'll include a link to this page here which tells you about the WAF2 format, but basically what you really need to know is that it's a way of compressing fonts, so you're going to get a smaller file size, and I've also noticed that with variable fonts, you seem to get a more consistent display across browsers if you're using WAF2 format instead of TTF. So to convert your TTF files into WAF2, there's a couple of sites you can go to. One is Font Squirrel, and you can just upload your font here and it will do the conversion for you. Or you can head to Everything Fonts, and this is an open source font, so you can check that it's fine for you to make this conversion. Then you just want to pick your font file, make the conversion. It will give you a zip file. Just download that somewhere in your drive and extract the file. For LibreFranklin, you're going to need to do that for two files, for the Italic and the Roman version. Once you've got your two zip files, you just want to go ahead and extract them. And there we've got the two WAF2 files that we're going to be using. So now just set up a folder to hold the code that we're going to be putting together. I'm going to use this folder that I'm already in, and for now I'm just going to delete these zip files. Create a new folder named Fonts. And I'm actually going to rename these fonts just so they're a bit easier to load in, so that their names aren't so verbose. Now I've just got LibreFranklin Italics and LibreFranklin Romans, and just going to drag and drop those into the fonts folder, and now they're ready to use. Alright, so let's begin the coding process. I'm working with Visual Studio Code here. You can use any code editor you like, and I have opened up the folder that I'm holding my project in here in the left sidebar. All right, so now I'm going to create a new HTML file. We're going to have a couple of different font families that we're using with, so to help distinguish them, I'm just going to call this one librafranklin.html. Now we're going to add in some basic page code. If you're using Visual Studio Code, the Emmet extension is already installed. If you're using Atom or another editor, then it's definitely worth your time to install Emmet. That's E-M-M-E-T. Because then you can just put in an exclamation mark, hit tab, and there's all of your basic code. We'll just change the title to Libra Franklin variable. All right, now the way that you want to load in a variable font is by using an @FontFace declaration. So first we're going to set up a pair of style tags. And then in between them, we're going to say @font-face. And now we're going to declare the name that we want to give to our font family. So we're going to say font-family, and we're going to call it Libra Franklin. On the next line, we need to specify the source of the files that are going to be loaded in. So we're going to say src. We'll set a URL. Make sure you got your brackets there. And then in between some single quote marks, we're going to specify the path that we set up here. So we've got fonts and then each one of our file names. I'm actually going to copy the name of this while we're here. It's going to go to rename and then just copy the whole file. I'm going to say fonts / Libra Franklin Romans. And we want the same code. I'm just going to copy and paste. And we also want to load in our italics. And you'll notice here that we're using the same font family name. And that's because we want to be able to call in either the Roman or the italic version of this font by using that font family Libra Franklin. We don't want to have to specify a different font family name every time we want to italicize something. We want to be able to just say font style italic. Now, because these two names are identical, we need to provide a way for the system to know which of these two is the normal style version of the font and which is the italic style. So first we'll specify that the font style of this font is italic. And now anywhere else that we use font style italic, where we have also said we want font family Libra Franklin, it's going to call in this version of the font. This is where you can get tripped up because in some advice you'll see people letting you know that you need to specify a font style italic, but if you specify a font style on one declaration of a same named font family, then it's also going to affect this font as well. Then it's actually going to make all of your text italic wherever you're using the Libra Franklin font style. So you also need to go up here and specify that you want the font style associated with this file to be normal. So that's really important that you set the font style on both of these declarations in order for this to work. All right, now let's put in a little bit of basic styling. We'll just apply it to the whole page. So we'll use the HTML element. We'll set the font size to 2.5 rem. Add in a line height. I always like 1.618, which is the golden ratio. And now we can specify our font family that we just set up. So now we can say font family, Libra Franklin. So now any text in the entire site is going to be using the Libra Franklin font. So now let's put in a little bit of dummy text so we can see how this is looking. So we'll just add a paragraph tag and we'll just add in Libra Franklin variable font. And I'm using the live server extension here to give me a live refresh locally hosted server to preview this file on. So I'm just going to hit this go live button at the bottom here. And there we go. That's our Libra Franklin variable font. So we can inspect it and make sure that the font is coming through correctly. So there we go. There's our font family. And now to make sure it really is variable, without digging into too much code that we actually need to cover in the next few lessons, I'm just going to vary this slightly. Just going to copy and paste in a little bit of code here. I'll explain how this works a little later. And there we go. That's thinned out our font beautifully. And then we need one more test, and that is to make sure that we can italicize it properly. So now we're going to say font style italic. Go back and check again. And there we go. It's beautifully italicized. All right, so that is how you load variable fonts into a website ready for use. Now that we've got our fonts in, we need to start looking at how we can control their look using CSS. So we're going to start by looking at the most fundamental concept when it comes to working with variable fonts in CSS, and that is the difference between high-level and low-level CSS properties. These are going to be the two ways that you can control variable fonts. We're going to go through what they are and how you'll be able to use them in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. We've got our font loaded into our site, and now we need to look at how we can actually control its variations and decide how it's going to look. The first thing we need to look at in order to understand that are the two types of CSS that we're being given to control variable fonts. And these two types are being described as high-level and low-level. There are going to be 4 high-level CSS properties for working with variable fonts that may expand further, but for now it's just 4. And we're going to have 1 low-level CSS property. Now the tricky thing is right now, the high-level properties aren't supported in browsers, so we're going to have to wait a little while before we can actually use them. However, it's still important to understand how they're going to work now because W3C are asking us to use the high-level properties wherever we can as a preference, and only use the low-level property when we absolutely need to. There's a few different reasons for this. I'll give you a link in the notes below this video to explain why. But just suffice to say, it's going to be important to know about these high-level properties. So even though we can't use them directly yet, we're going to dig into how they work. And we can actually look pretty closely at that because we can already recreate the effects that you're going to get using high-level properties by using a low-level property. If that all just sounds like it doesn't make a lot of sense yet, then just hold tight for a minute because we're going to go through all of this and it will make sense by the end. All right, so we're going to have these 4 high-level properties. They're going to be font weight, font stretch, font style, and font optical sizing. These first 3 you're already familiar with from just working with regular CSS, but they don't yet interact with variable fonts in the way that they're going to in the future. And this 4th property is, as far as I'm aware, specific to variable fonts, so it won't do anything at all right now. And then in the low-level category, we're going to have just 1 property. That property is going to be font, variation, settings. This one is already fully operational in the browser, so that's the one that you have to use to interact with variable fonts for now, until we have all of these 4 working in the way that they're going to in the future. All right, now in the context of working with variable fonts, each one of these high-level properties is going to interact with a specific axis, and it's going to interact with that axis through a 4-letter string, a 4-letter label that each axis has. Font weight is going to interact with the weight axis, as you'd probably expect. And the 4-letter label for the weight axis is WGHT. And the reason we want to know what the 4-letter label for the axis is because we'll need this label in order to interact with the axis through font variation settings. So if we want to simulate the effect of using font weight with a variable font, then we're going to take this string and use it with this property. And you'll see how that works in just a second. The font stretch property is going to work with the width axis, and the width axis is represented by WDTH. The font style property is actually going to be able to interact with 2 axes. It's going to be able to interact with the italic axes, which will be represented by ITAL, and also the slant axis, which will be represented by SLNT. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the differences between these two and why you can have 2 axes to work with 1 property in a dedicated lesson a little bit later. And then finally, the font optical sizing property will interact with the optical size axis, and it will be represented by OPSZ, or Z, depending where you come from. All right, now let's look at the way this property is going to work so we can see what the relevance of all this information up here is. So after you've added a font variation settings property to a style, you'll of course add a colon, and then what you'll need to do is add some quotation marks and then specify the 4-letter label for the axis that you want to modify. So if you want to modify the weight axis, then you would specify WGHT. So you remember from up here, that's the axis that represents font weight, and we might say we want the font weight to be 300. but you might also want to modify the width at the same time. So that would be this up here. In this case, you would add a comma so that you can add another value, add another pair of single quote marks, and then specify WDTH, make a space, and then add whatever value you need to add for your font. And then you would close it off with a semicolon. So let me just comment all of this out so that we can have some proper formatting showing up here. All right, so this is how you would modify the weight and the width of a variable font using a low-level property. But when our high-level properties are working as well, an equivalent set of code would be to specify font weight as 300 and font stretch as 100. So this code and this code do exactly the same thing. And that's how you're going to be able to use font variation settings to experiment with variable fonts, even while these properties aren't working in the way that they're going to work in the future. At the same time, remember that when these properties are working the way that they're going to be able to work, if you can use this code, then you should use it instead of this code. So what this property is really for is when you need to target those custom axes like we saw with fonts like Decovar, where almost none of them are standard and you need to work with axes that don't have a high-level property to represent them at all. But for now, because it is the only fully functioning property, that's what we're going to be working with for the rest of the course as we go through and explore what these 4 high-level properties are going to be able to do, and then we're going to dig further in to what we can do using custom axes and the font variation settings property. So we're going to go through each of those 4 high-level properties one at a time, and we're going to start by looking at font weight and how it works in a variable fonts context. So we're going to go through that in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to go through the first of the 4 high-level properties that you're going to have to work with variable fonts, and that is going to be font weight. Unfortunately for now, font weight is not actually ready to work with variable fonts, so we're just going to comment that out for now to remind us what we're actually looking at, and instead we're going to use font variation settings. As we mentioned before, if we want to use font variation settings, we need to target a 4-letter label that represents a particular axis. We're working with weight, so that's going to be WGHT. Then we add a space, and this is where we're going to be able to put the numerical value that we want to use to represent our font weight. I'm just going to end that line for now. Now, you're probably already used to a certain set of numbers that typically represent normal weight or bold weight or extra bold, black, etc. And before I started this lesson, I did remove the extra weight control and italics that I had on here before. So make sure that you just have these lines and this before you move on, because that is going to give you the default look of the Libra Franklin font, and that's what we want. And the first thing that we're going to try to do is set this font so that it's going to show us the regular font weight. If we have a look at this font on Google Fonts, this is what regular should look like. And normally, if you wanted to set a font to be regular weight, you would set its font weight to 400. That's the standard size. And if we take a look on the Google font version again, it's going to select this font. And then in the Customize tab, you can see here that sure enough, regular is usually represented by 400. So let's try applying that value and see what happens. We're going to set the weight to 400. We'll save, have another look. And nothing has changed, so that's very strange. All right, well, what happens then if we go with a different weight? Maybe we'll try setting it to bold on purpose. We'll set it to 700. Change that to 700. And weird, still nothing's changed. All right, so now let's try a lower number instead. Let's try 100. 100 should represent a super thin weight. We'll change that to 100. Okay, well, now it's thinner, but it's definitely not as thin as that. So what's going on here? And this is where we have to remember that the value ranges on the axis of variable fonts, at least for now, are completely determined by the font designer. So if you're punching in numbers and you're wondering why you're getting no change, then what you're going to have to do is go to one of your variable font preview tools that we talked about earlier, like Axis Praxis, and then you're going to need to look here to see what range you actually have to work with for the weight on this specific font. So if I click to select this text, if I drag all the way to the left and you look at this little box here, it's a little small, but it says 40. So the minimum weight on this font is 40. And if I drag up, this number now says 200. So the maximum weight you can actually have on this font is 200. So when you start adding in values like 400 and 700, those are so far outside the range that all they do is clamp that weight down to the highest value, which is 200, and that's why when we added in 400 and 700, it still just looked fat and chunky like this text here. And it's also why when we put in 100, our text became smaller, but not super small like we expected it to be. And this is again where we come back to the named instances being useful, even though we can't directly target them with our CSS. So now what if we choose the regular? I'll just switch this to normal Libra Franklin for now. We switch to regular. What weight do we actually need to make our font look regular? And this number in here, again, sorry, it's quite small, but the number that we actually need is 84. So now let's change our font weight to 84 and see what we get. All right, now that's looking like the regular font weight. So if we compare it to Google Fonts, there's the regular font weight. And what if we want it to be bold? So we'll go to the named instance, we'll choose bold, we'll look up this number, and the value that we actually need for bold is 154. So now let's try 154 and see what we get. There we go, that's much better. That is the correct size for bold. So now what we could actually do when we're setting up the CSS to work with this font is go through each of these named instances and find the number that gives us the correct representation for the weights if we want to use the standard weights that the font comes with, and we can add them into our code one at a time. So I'm just going to copy and paste in a bunch of code. You'll get access to this file, so you'll be able to open it up and look directly at it if you don't want to go typing all of this code up yourself. But what we can actually do, I'm just going to comment this out, is we can create a class to represent each one of the weights that we want to use. So this has each one of the correct values in that's pulled from the named instances, and then whenever we want a font to be light, we add the light class. We want it to be medium, then we add the medium class. And we've also in here added a class named Italic, that if we want our text to be italicized, we can just add this class to it as well. I'm just going to add some text in here down below so we can demonstrate this. So we've got some text for each one of the weights that we've just recreated in CSS. So we've got thin, thin italic, extra light italic, and so on. So now let's see how that looks. And there we go. Sure enough, we now have all of the correct weights for our font. Everything that we see here has been perfectly reproduced. And this is actually the code that I showed you earlier in the course to demonstrate the difference in load speed. So we have all of these different variations, but we're only using 2 files. And that also shows you how the weight axis works with a variable font. And that is how font weight is going to work with variable fonts once we have the update to that property. I will include the caveat that this is still a spec that is in flux. There may be changes, but this is the best information that we have to go on at the moment. So right now, we're going to assume that if you wanted to do the same thing with a high-level property in future, you would specify a font weight, and then you would give a value of 40, and so on and so forth for all of your other weights. Now, this setup of using classes to control your font styling, that might not be the perfect way that you want to have your styling set up because of the fact that you're going to need to be tying these classes into your markup, and that might not be semantic enough. However, if you're just using plain CSS, that's probably going to be the most efficient option. However, if you want to use a preprocessor then what you would be able to do is set up mix-ins that would contain the correct font variation settings that you would need to give you the recreation of a certain named instance. Then you would be able to pull those mix-ins into a more semantically relevant class name to control the styling in a particular area. So that just all depends on if you're using vanilla CSS or you're working with a preprocessor and what your preferred coding conventions are. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the second of our 4 high-level properties, and that is font stretch, which represents the width axis. So I will see you in the next lesson. Hey, and welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In the last lesson, we looked at one of the 4 high-level properties that we're going to have to work with variable fonts, and in this lesson, we're going to look at another one, and that is going to be font stretch, which is going to control the width axes. So in order to do that, we're going to be working with the Envato serif font. You can see with this slider here, this is our width axes. And I'm also going to show you another thing that can be very useful with the Axis Praxis website, as long as you have a font with a license that allows you to freely use that font. Now I'm going to explain what I mean. The Envato serif font, we can see here, is a part of this repository. And if we look at the license, then we can see that this is an open license. That means that we're okay to download and use the font. However, what I found was when I downloaded from this repository and then converted into a WAF2 file, the font that I got as a result didn't actually respond to variable settings. So instead, to get a font that definitely works, obviously we know this font works, I'm actually going to pull the font file off Axis Praxis. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to bring up the source in this window here, expand the head, and then if we have a look inside this style with the ID web fonts, then along here you can see the URL of the font. So I'm just going to copy this part of the URL and I'm going to paste it onto the end of the Axis Praxis URL, which is then going to give me a file that I can download. You can see that I've already done that. This was the file that didn't work, and this was the file that did work. So you can just pull that down into your project. Don't make a habit out of downloading files from a site like this. But if you're really stuck, you really need to work with a font and you can't get a working version of it, then it is one option. And of course, don't do that with a font that you don't have the rights to access. Some of the fonts on this site do require a purchase, so make sure that you do that before you make use of a font. All right, so now we're going to make another file. We'll call this one photoserif.html. And then we're just going to set up the file in the same way that we did with our Libra Franklin. So add in our basic code, photoserif. Then we're going to do the same thing that we did in this page here. We're going to add a font face rule. I'm just going to copy this. It's going to make it a little bit quicker. So we'll add in our style tags. And then in between our style tags, we'll add our font face rule. And now we can just edit it. We don't need a font style on this one. We want the font name to be Envato Serif. And then here is the font we want to use. So I'm just going to highlight it and press F2 to go into renaming mode. Copy the font name, and I'm just going to paste that in here. So that is going to load up our font. And we'll grab this HTML styling here. Just go through this as quickly as we can. Delete these other aspects. Change the font family name. We're applying to Envato Serif. And then we just need a little bit of text. Say Envato Serif variable font. We've still got our Libra Franklin file open here from before, so all we need to do is put the name of the file in that we just created, which was Envato Serif, and there's our Envato Serif font. So to help make this look a little bit more like what we see here, we're going to start by increasing the font size. So with this one, let's bump that up to 5 rem. So now that's much larger. And what we're going to be looking at is the width axis of this font. While we're at it, we're also going to look at the fact that with font variation settings, you can actually target multiple axes at once. So we're going to add in our font variation settings property. And before we move into adding a width axis, we're actually going to target the weight first and bring it down quite a bit. So here we're going to do just what we did in the last lesson. We're going to put in the 4-letter label for weight, which is WGHT. And we're going to bring the weight down to 60. That weight of 60 is something that I've taken from this figure here. So we know that this text here has a weight of 60. And now we can start working with the width axes as well. So all we need to do is add a comma, and now we can add in another axis name. So we'll add our single quotes, and now to target the width axes, we're going to add WDTH. And once again, let's simulate what we have here. And we're going to try to reproduce the width that we have showing up, which is about 92. So we're going to add a space, set our width 92, and then end our line. Now this width axis here, when we get full access to our high-level properties, this is going to be controlled with the property font stretch. I'll just comment that out for now. Just leave it there as a reminder of what we're working with. So we'll save that and let's check out our results. And then sure enough, there we go. We've got a really nice, elegant looking font that is the same width and weight as what we saw on Axis Praxis. Now, with each different type of axes, there are rules as to what the range can be. Some axes are allowed to go into the negative and some aren't. Some have an upper limit and some don't. And with the width axes, the only rule is that the value has to be greater than 0. So you know that whatever you're dealing with a particular font, you're never going to have to deal with negative numbers. However, what we're seeing so far with variable fonts is that the range can be quite different from font to font. If we look at the range on Envato Serif, which we can do by dragging the width slider all the way down, the bottom figure that we have is 50, and the highest figure is 130. Again, apologies for these tiny numbers. Unfortunately, the layout for this site won't let me shrink it down to a size where I can really show those numbers to you clearly, so I'll just read them all out for you. Then we have the compressor font, which is a completely different range. Its lowest weight goes down to 10, and its highest goes up to 100. You can also have fonts where the range is a very small amount. So Avenir Next is only 100 at the top and 75 at the bottom. So it's only got 25 points of variance. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Winner font, which goes all the way down to 0 and all the way up to 1,000. So you've got a fairly wild amount of fluctuation. Obviously, the wider the range on a particular font, the more fine tuning you're going to be able to do. But basically, don't expect there to be any great deal of consistency in between one font and the next as far as width goes. You are just going to have to take that bit of time to get to know each font. Who knows, we may see some standardization in the future, but for now, just be ready for that fairly high amount of variance. And then finally, bringing that all back to font stretch, if we were going to recreate this setting here using the font stretch property, at this point in time, based on the information we have, we'll assume that we'd say font stretch 92. All right, so that is everything that we know about the font stretch high-level property and the width axes at the moment. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about the third of our high-level properties, and that is font style, which controls the slant and italic axes. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. So far we've talked about 2 of the 4 high-level properties that we're going to be able to use to control variable fonts. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about the third, and that is the font style property. Now, unfortunately, there weren't any open source, freely available fonts that I could use to demonstrate this to you in code. So what I'm going to do is just show you the code that's involved, and then we're going to go through Axis Praxis and have a look at the effect of modifying the axes in question. All right, so the property that we're talking about is font style. And this is something that you'll already be familiar with through using it to set italics on regular text as we already have it. And as we mentioned earlier, there are 2 axes that it affects. It affects the italic axes, which is represented with the label ital, and it also represents the slant axes, which is represented with the label SLNT. So if we want to use font variation settings to target the italic axes, we would do that with the ital string, and then we would add in a value. Now, if a font designer is using the officially registered italic axes, then the value range provided has to be somewhere in between 0 representing no italics at all, just regular upright text, or 1, which represents a fully italicized state. However, if we want to target the slant axis, we'll use SLNT as our string, and then this value can be anywhere between -90 and +90. So it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but if you want to make letters lean forward using the slant axes, then you have to use a negative number. And the furthest that they can be made to lean is a 90-degree angle. So basically, if you put in a value of -90, if a font allowed for that value, those letters would be lying pretty much flat on their side. If you put in a value of 0, the letters would have no slant at all applied to them. And if you put in a positive value in the other direction, let's say 90, then those letters would be leaning all the way backwards as far as they could go. So just remember, the italic axis goes between 0 and 1, and the slant axis goes between -90 and +90, with a negative value representing a forward slant. All right, now let's head over to Axis Praxis, and I'll show you a couple of these things in action. Now, the question that you're probably asking is, well, what is the difference between italic and slant anyway, and how come there are two axes that are being targeted by one property? Well, typically, the difference is that when you have true italics, you have different glyphs, so the actual shape of the letters is different. A good example of proper italics is Libra Franklin that we've been using, and that is why you have these two different font files here, because the Roman version has differently shaped letters to the italicized version. They're not just made to tip forward. However, if you're using slanting, which can also be referred to with the term oblique, you're actually taking the exact same letter shape and you're just tipping it a little bit, either forwards or backwards. Now, because of that distinction, the fact that italics are supposed to represent different glyphs, different shaped letters, and slant is just supposed to be tipping a letter forward, it's assumed that any font is only going to be using italics or slanting. So when you use font style, the browser should be able to look at the font file and see if it's using italics or slanting, and then it should be able to interpret the values that you put against that property correctly. So that is how, strictly speaking and technically speaking, those values are kind of supposed to be used, but at the moment, it seems like fonts are being a little bit more loose with those definitions. So I'll show you what I mean. So we have this font here, Compressor, which uses the italic axes, but as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any change in the shape of the glyphs. They are just actually slanting them forwards, but it's using the italic axes nonetheless, probably just because the word italic is a little bit more familiar to us. And you can see, you might have to bring up this page yourself to look at it properly again, because the numbers are quite small, but you see that 0 represents no italics, and then we can go all the way up to 1, which is the maximum italic. Here we have the winner font, and this font uses the slant axes, and it might seem a little strange that the slant slider is all the way over to the right. You kind of would intuitively think that if you want something to slant forward, slant to the right, then you would need to move a slider to the right, but it's actually the opposite. Because you remember that the slant value corresponds to an angular rotation. So when you want to slant this text forward, you actually need to move into the negative. So as I drag this down, the number moves into the negative and we see the font slanting forwards. And you'll notice here that it maxes out at -15, which represents a 15-degree slant. Even though it theoretically could go as low as -90, it's still up to the font designer to determine what angle is going to be the maximum that the font can still look good at. And you'll notice also it doesn't go into a positive range because the designer has decided they don't want this font to be able to slant backwards. This is another example. We have norm shrift. Again, we drag this into the negative. We see the letters slanting forwards, and that also goes between -15 and 0. And then this one is seemingly a bit of a mix because it's using the term slanted rather than slant, and the range goes from 0 all the way up to 1,000. So that one has pretty much decided to go its own way. So as I mentioned, even though there are rules and guidelines, things are being approached a little bit more liberally. We may see that tighten up as time goes forward, and we may see a bit more standardization. But for now, particularly with the italic and slant axes, just be aware that things might not be 100% by the rule book. When you do have fonts that are going by those rules, then you'll understand what you're looking at, with italic being between 0 and 1, and slant being between -90 and up to +90. So when it comes to actually using the font style property, when it's ready, we can assume that if you have a font using the italic axes, if you want it to be fully italic, you'll set that value to font style equals 1. Whereas if you have a font using the slant axes, you'll set that font style to somewhere around -15 if you want it to be fully italicized. And in both cases, setting the value to 0 should set the letters perfectly upright. Alright, so that covers the font style property as well as the italic and slant axes. We just have one more high-level property to cover, and that is the font optical sizing property. So we're going to go through that in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the last of our 4 high-level properties that we can use to control variable fonts, and that is the font optical sizing property. So for this, we're going to go back to our Voto Serif font that we're working with the lesson before last. And if you have a look at this font, we have it looking pretty nice, but if you compare it to what we see at Axis Praxis, you'll notice that it looks slightly different. There's a bit more thinness in certain areas of the lettering, whereas our font is a little thicker all the way around. What's creating that difference is the optical sizing axis. So the basic idea behind font optical sizing is that when you have your text very small, you don't want to have any of the kind of really thin lettering that you see here in this text. Whereas on the other hand, when your text becomes very large, you don't want it to be super chunky. You want to have a little bit of variation in the widths of different parts of the letters. So optical sizing allows you to control that. So to demonstrate, I'm going to drag the size of this font way down, and you'll notice it's actually dragging the optical size dragger with it at the same time. But to demonstrate though, we're going to have this text go very small, and then we're going to drag the optical size all the way up. And you see that when the optical size is up too high, you have all of these thin, sketchy parts of the letters that are very difficult to read. Whereas if we drag the optical size down, now it thickens up those sections, so we still have the same look in the font, but it's a lot more readable. On the other hand, when we drag this all the way up, but we have the optical size low, now it looks way too chunky. It doesn't have any of that same sort of elegance. If we have the optical size higher, now we have this nice variation, this nice calligraphy type of a look to the lettering. So once again, when these high-level properties are ready, we're going to be able to use the property font optical sizing, and then we'll be able to specify the value that we want. So we're just going to comment that out for now. And in our font variation settings property, we're going to add the 4-letter label for the optical sizing axes, which is OPSZ or Z, and then we can enter in an appropriate value. So once again, we'll refer to Axis Praxis, and I'm just going to refresh the page so that we get back to our defaults. And here we can see that the optical size is set to 72. So we'll go back to our code, we'll set our optical size to 72 and save. And now there we go, we've got our variance to our font, we've got the nice thin aspects to our lettering here, while the downstrokes on the letters all retain their thickness. So with the case of this font, it's almost more of a design preference, tuning in that optical sizing. But with some fonts, it can really be essential to have that optical sizing because when you change other parameters, it can completely blow out how the font looks. So for example, with this Amstelvár font, when we shrink down the width of this font, you can see that the letters get really crowded really quickly and they start to look pretty difficult to read. It does help to reduce the weight a little bit, but it's still not quite right. But when we change the optical sizing, now you can see that we're getting an adjustment that's bringing us back to much nicer looking lettering. So if you have a font that's not looking quite how you want it to look when you're modifying the width and the weight settings, then jump into the optical size settings and have a play with that too, and it can correct your lettering and bring it back into legibility. And then once again, just to bring that back around to our high-level font settings, to our high-level properties, when everything's ready, instead of using font variation settings, you would just set font optical sizing, and then you would set it to 72 or whatever value was appropriate. All right, so now we've gone through weight, width, italic, slant, and optical sizing, as well as the properties font weight, font stretch, font style, and font optical sizing that go along with them. So that's all of the official registered axes and properties. Now we want to look at what happens when you need to deal with custom axes. We're going to go through that in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. So far we've gone through all of the standard fonts, all of the pre-registered fonts, where you know in advance what each one of the little 4-letter labels are that represent each axis, so that you know how you can target those axes for changes when you're working with either high-level CSS properties or with the font variation settings property. But there is a massive world of axes that are available in variable fonts that are completely custom. Adjusting them could do anything that the font designer comes up with, and the 4-letter label that represents them could be anything. And one of the things to be aware of as far as the difference between the standard axes goes and custom axes is that any custom axis must be represented with uppercase letters. On the other hand, all of the registered axes are represented with lowercase letters. So if you're looking through some code for a variable font and you see uppercase letters versus lowercase letters, you'll know what those two things mean. Now you already know if you want to modify the values that are corresponding with custom axes that you need to use that low-level CSS property. But the next question is, if these custom axes and labels could be anything, then how are you supposed to figure out which 4-letter label corresponds with which effect? I think we're probably going to see more tools come along to help us with this. In particular, I keep an eye on Firefoxing as they're already working on dev tools for variable fonts. But for now, the best and easiest way that I've found of figuring out what 4-letter labels do what is, once again, working with Axis Praxis. So right here, we're looking at the Gnomon font. And if we look over here at our two axes, we can see that neither of these are official registered axes. Both of them are custom. We've got time of day and shadow distance. Now, even here, we know the label for the axes, but we don't know its 4-letter code. So what I do is just right-click on the text in question and inspect it. If we look down in the code, you can see that we've got some inline CSS, and in this inline CSS, we've got our font variation settings property. And right here, we can see one of the 4-letter codes associated with this font, and that is dist, D-I-S-T, which is representing shadow distance. In this case, you can actually see that only one of the codes is showing up here. Sometimes you just need to move one of the sliders in order to get the value for that axis showing up as well. And then when you move it, you're going to see the code there change, so you know that shadow distance is corresponding with the DIST code. And then over here, time of day is corresponding with the TOTD code. So for now, I think that's the easiest way to figure out what code you need to work with and which axes they correspond with. And this actually brings me also to what right now is probably the easiest way to reproduce named instances in your CSS and to carry over the changes that you've made here by using the Axis Praxis preview tool into your code as well. So let's dive straight into probably the most complicated variable font that we've got right now, and that is Decovar. We've got all kinds of different variations along here. This is an open source font. So what we're going to do is grab this font, integrate it into a web page using the same steps that we have in previous lessons. And this is a free font, so you can download it from GitHub. There'll be a link to here in the notes below this video. The font that you want to use is inside the fonts folder. Just use this one here, Decovar alpha vf.ttf. Then put that through the converter to WAF2 format like we did before. Download the converted file into the fonts folder for the project that we've already been working on. And then just make another web page the exact same way that we have before, called Decovar HTML. Put Decovar in the title. Load in the font file using a font face declaration. Add in the basic HTML style and add a little bit of text. And then that should give you this representation of the Decovar font. Now, just on a little side note, it's actually interesting to notice that Chrome has probably the most scratchy display of this font at the moment. Meanwhile, Firefox is looking a little bit better, and so is Edge. So you can keep using Chrome for this lesson, or if you want, you might prefer to use Firefox Nightly or Edge. All right, now let's pick one of these instances and try to recreate it in our page. How about this one here? We're just going to right click it, inspect, and now all we have to do is check out all of this inline CSS, double click so we can edit it, look for the font variation settings line here, and then highlight all the way through until the end of this property, copy, and then in our HTML tag here, just paste in that line. So we'll save that and see what our results are. And there we go. Just like that, we've recreated that look from the Access Praxis preview page. We haven't had to manually go through and add in any of these codes. We haven't had to manually tweak values. All we had to do was just go into that CSS that's in line that we can see through the inspector, and that just instantly recreates that look for us. And of course, we can do that with any of these. So even this sort of crazy chunky looking one here, just inspect that line, double click in here to edit, copy the font variation settings property. It's going to comment out the line that we put in before, add in a new one, and there we go. There's that very ornate style that we saw in Access Praxis. And of course, if you just want to set up your own variations here, anything that you want, set the sliders to whatever you need them to be, and then just do the same thing, because this inline code will have adjusted depending on what you've changed in the sliders here. All right, so now we've covered all of the official registered axes, we've covered custom axes, we've covered high-level and low-level CSS properties. The only thing that's left for us now to make sure that we're including in our CSS is some kind of fallback to fill that gap until all browsers are up to speed with variable font support. So we're going to go through how you can set up a fallback for your variable fonts in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Up and Running with Variable Fonts. In this lesson, we're going to be going over the last thing that you need to be aware of when you're working with variable fonts, and that is how to set up fallbacks. It's going to be a little while until we've got full compatibility across all the major browsers, and when we do, you're still going to need to support legacy browsers anyway. And now what I've got here on the screen is just a trimmed down version of the file that we created earlier when we were working with the Libra Franklin font. So I've just saved it as a new file name, underscore with fallback, added in a new title. And now I'm only loading in the Romans version of the font because I just want to minimize the amount of code that you're working with in order to see how fallbacks work. You'll be able to expand this out to work with any amount of code that you need to. And we've just got our same HTML styling, and we're just working with two looks on the font here, the regular weight and the bold weight. If we preview that code in Chrome, everything looks just fine. We've got our Libra Franklin regular and bold, and they appear just as we expect. However, this is the current version of Firefox, not Nightly. And as you can see, the weights are incorrect. It's actually loading in the font, but it's just not displaying it properly. So now let's go ahead and set up a fallback for that. Now, just a quick note, you will see some articles that are a little bit older now, giving you the advice of using this code, format WAF2 variations, in your font face declaration and using that as a way to detect support levels. However, that doesn't work anymore for a couple of reasons. One, because Safari was the only browser that was properly supporting that code anyway, and from what I've read, that syntax is going to be changing. So don't rely on that as a way to detect browser support. What we're going to do instead is set up a couple of @supports rules. And we're going to use this to detect whether this property is supported. I'm just going to add brackets, add this inside, and then put :normal. Now right now, that's a reliable way to check on support. If this property is supported, then so is everything else to do with variable fonts. If it's not, then you need another solution. So what we're going to do is put all of our variable font related code in between these brackets, and then it's only going to be used by the browser if variable fonts are supported. We're going to grab our font face rule and put that up here. Make a little bit of space. This code is generic. That will work with or without variable fonts, so we'll keep that there. But we'll move these lines up inside our supports rule as well. Because obviously this rule here is only going to work if we have proper support. I'm going to save that, and now let's look at the difference between the two browsers. So Chrome is still looking just fine because it does support variable fonts. But in Firefox, we have no font formatting at all. It's detected that this browser doesn't support variable fonts, doesn't support that particular property, so it's not using any of that code inside that rule. So now you need to be able to set up the code that is going to control the font styling on this non-supporting browser. And this is where you have a couple of options. We know that we can make this font, Libra Franklin, look exactly the same as with our variable font version, but we have to load in the standard static versions of the font in order for that to work. We need the regular version and the bold version. But ideally, we don't want to load those font files in if we don't have to, because we're trying to use variable fonts to minimize the amount of font loading that we're doing. So one option that you have is to set up another rule, another supports rule. Just copy and paste what we just wrote. Only this time you say supports not, and you can put your fallback code inside this rule. So now if the browser does not support this property, then use this code. However, the tricky part is this rule is only going to fire off if the browser also supports the @supports declaration. So if we go to can I use, this shows us the browsers that will work if we have all of our font styling code wrapped up in these @supports declarations. So you can see here browsers are pretty strong with this API. The only red flag we've got here is IE 11. So it really depends on how far back you need to go, how far back your legacy port needs to be. If you need to support IE 11 and other browsers that don't work with the @supports rules, then your options are to put your non-variable font code outside any support detection mechanism just to load the unrequired font files anyway. Or perhaps if you really need to go a long way back with legacy support, maybe reconsider using variable fonts for the time being. But if you're working with a browser other than IE 11 or other really old browsers, then you can put your fallback code inside this declaration here. I already went ahead and converted the TTF files for Libra Franklin Bold and Libra Franklin Regular into WAF2 files. I'm just going to hit F2 to rename and copy that file name, because in our fallback code here, we're going to load in this font. So it's going to grab all of the code from up here, paste it down here, get it indented nicely. Then I'm going to take this file name and we're going to load that in up here. So that brings in our regular weight, and on this line, we're actually going to change this so that we associate font weight normal with our regular font weight file that we're loading in. I'm just going to copy this code again so that we can load in the bold version of the file. So that's this one here. So we've got our bold file being loaded in. We're going to change this to font weight bold. And now all we need to do is update our styles so that for the regular class, we're saying font weight normal. And for the bold class, we're saying font weight bold. So now what we've done up here with our variable font, we've recreated where there's no support with this code here. We're loading in twice the number of files, and we don't have the option for so many different weights, but for this purpose, it's going to give us the same result. So now let's take a look. All right, so sure enough, our Libra Franklin font here is looking the same, and if we just refresh with the network tab open, we can confirm that we're still loading in the variable font here, Libra Franklin Romans. We go to Firefox. There we go. Now we've got the look that we want with our Libra Franklin font, but here, now we can see if we go into the Fonts tab up here on Firefox's inspection tools, then we're loading in the regular font file and the bold font file. So that is how you can handle a fallback. Use an @supports rule on the font variation settings property to check that a browser does have support, then put all of your variable font code inside this rule. Then have the inverse of that, see if variable fonts are not supported, and put your fallback code inside there. Alright, so that is everything that we need to cover to get you fully ready to work with variable fonts. So you've got all the theory on how they function, and you've got all the tools you need to actually start using them in your code and in your websites. So now I've got just one more video in the course. We're going to wrap up everything that we've stepped through, and I'm just going to give you a little summary that bullet points all the most important factors of working with variable fonts. You'll be able to come back to this video anytime that you need a quick refresher, just to jog your memory and remind you of those key elements of working with variable fonts. So I hope you'll join me in the final video. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome to the final video in Up and Running with Variable Fonts. This is just going to be a quick recap. Come back to this video anytime that you need a refresher on the most important elements of working with variable fonts. Alright, first up, why use variable fonts? Number one, because they load much faster. You can do the job of 7 or 8 font files with a single font file. 2, they give you a lot more freedom and ability to be creative with your typography, because you have all kinds of different ways that you can change up a font and you get to decide exactly how that font is going to look in your design. Variable font fundamentals. Variable fonts have settings that are referred to as axes, and it's the values that are associated with each one of those axes that determines how a variable font is going to look. Those axes can get fairly complicated if there's a lot of them, so many font designers will create something called named instances that are a quick and easy way to bring up different combinations of axis settings that have already been determined to look good with that font file. As for where to find variable fonts, the number one place is axis-praxis.org. Axis Praxis have a great spreadsheet that they manage. It's a comprehensive list of fonts. We also have v-fonts.com. For preview tools, again, use the Axis Praxis website. Or if you're comfortable with building software from source, you can try the Font View application, which you can get on GitHub. Another option for previewing is Adobe software, which you can also use for UI design. Other UI design tools right now don't support variable fonts, but some of them have shown interest, so definitely keep an eye out. Browser support right now is strongest with Chrome and Edge. Safari is good too, but you must have Mac OS 10.13 or higher. Firefox support is on the way, and right now you can use Nightly, which does have support for variable fonts and also has some very interesting looking dev tools coming up for working with variable fonts. Okay, on to coding with variable fonts. Deploy your variable fonts using @fontface rules, and control your variable fonts using high-level properties and low-level properties. We have 4 high-level properties. We have font weight, font stretch, font style, and font optical sizing. We have 1 low-level property, which is font variation settings. The high-level properties aren't working in browsers yet, so in the meantime, use font variation settings to replicate the effect of those high-level properties. But when they are available, use those properties wherever you can, and use font variation settings only when you have to. The font weight property represents the axis WGHT in lowercase. The values that you can apply in font weight can be anywhere between 1 and 999, but the range of values for a specific font can vary wildly, so be sure that you check the specific font in question to see what range of values are available for that font. Font stretch represents the WTH axis width. Values for this axis can be anything greater than 0. Again, check the font for specifics. Font style interacts with either the slant, SLNT axes, or the italic, ITAL axes. Fonts will only have either slant or italic, so we ought to be able to use the font style property to interact with either one of those axes. If a font uses the slant axes, its value range could be anything between -90 and +90. A negative number indicates leaning forward, a positive number indicates leaning backwards, and 0 indicates straight up and down. As usual, check the specific font to find out what the appropriate values are to use. If a font uses the italic axes, its values will range between 0, which is fully upright, and 1, which is fully leaning forward. Font optical sizing represents the optical sizing axes, which is labeled OPSZ or Z. This property is used to modify how much variance there is in the thickness of the strokes of the letters, and it enables you to enhance legibility and readability at different font sizes. Custom axes could be anything that a font designer decides they should be. They are also represented by a 4-letter label, but custom 4-letter labels are always in uppercase while official are in lowercase. Right now, the easiest way to figure out what custom axes are available in a particular font is to go to Axis Praxis, preview that font, and then inspect the inline CSS to see what labels are being used. And to set up fallbacks for your variable fonts, use an @supports rule Check for support of the font variation settings property with just a normal value, and then put all of your variable font code inside that support detection rule. Use an inverse check, look to see if that property is not selected, and then put your fallback code inside that check. And that is everything that you need to know right now to start working with variable fonts. We may see some developments in the future. We might see some new things coming in. We might see some tweaks to what we have right now with this system, but things should remain fundamentally the same. So I hope that you've really enjoyed working with variable fonts and that you're feeling confident to get out there and start using them. Thank you so much for taking this course, and I will see you in the next one.